Yes, what do I want to talk about in the next 35-40 minutes? Briefly explain what I mean by bodily distress. We've already mentioned it and why it is an orphan disease. Discuss problems with early models of this problem and go through different stages of developing the model of bodily distress, including a new perspective on the brain. Bodily distress, you've said it, there are three types of complaints, of types of symptoms: pain in different locations, functional disturbances, seemingly disturbed cardiovascular functions, gastrointestinal functions and others, and everything around the topic of fatigue, exhaustions. And the patients, they go to the doctors, they have multiple examinations, but there is no clear organic pathology to be found which explains the disease, the complaints. This is a very frequent problem in primary care. We say about a quarter of all patients belong to this group, and there is a misconception very often that this is a minor problem, the worried well or something like that, but that's completely wrong. There are many patients with these enduring chronic complaints who suffer, whose health-related quality of life is considerably lower than even of patients with clearly defined organic disease. Why do I say this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but why is it an orphan disease? Well, first of all, it doesn't have a clear place in our classification system. It has multiple places, and this already indicates somehow it has no real place. On the one hand, you can classify these patients, and that's the tradition we in psychosomatic medicine know best, as a mental disorder, as a somatoform, or how it is now called in the DSM system, a somatic symptom disorder. One of the most frequent types of it is a pain disorder. But also you will find in all parts of this somatic classification system, you will find specific functional somatic syndromes, like, for instance, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, and do not think that these are different diseases. These are different perspectives on the same type of problem. So if you are a psychiatrist, a psychosomatic specialist, you would classify the patient as pain disorder, and the same patient going to a rheumatologist would be classified probably as having fibromyalgia. Neither, and that's part of the orphan problem, neither parent discipline, neither the psychodisciplines nor the somatic disciplines really take care of this huge problem. They very often try to explain away the problem. For instance, in psychiatry there was a long tradition, it's not now, but a long tradition of explaining patients with these enduring bodily problems as having masked depression, although on a phenomenological level they clearly were not depressed. That was an interpretation. That's probably better. But also in these somatic specialties, people very often say, well, we simply have not found the organic explanation. It's a real organic problem. So there is a significant neglect of this problem in research and clinical care, and we realize that all the time trying to get funding, for instance, for this research. But we shouldn't only look to the others. Also, the people who've directly addressed this topic did, in a certain sense, traditionally not do full justice to this phenomenon of suffering chronically from bodily distress. I cannot go through this comprehensively. I will look at one example of psychodynamic models. I think at least some of you will know this quite well-known picture of a model developed by Franz Alexander in his book Psychosomatic Medicine, 1950, in which he tried to explain not only functional bodily problems, but also in the first stage of the model, organic bodily disease. If you look here in the center, there's a psychodynamic circle between different impulses, effort, competitive aggression, which results in anxiety or guilt, infantile dependency, inferiority feelings, narcissistic process. So this, in a way, is a normal psychodynamic circle of different impulses and reactions to it. And it is also normal that competitive aggression, and I have these parts only in German, unfortunately, aggression leads to impulses of fight or flight. And if you like, pathological bit of the thing is this blockage here. So there is some intrapsychic blockage of this impulse of fight or fear, flight or fight. And this leads to an overactivation of the sympathetic autonomous nervous system. And this chronic overactivation of the autonomous nervous system leads to the different bodily complaints and diseases. And the same the other way in blockage of impulses of being cared for, which lead to overactivations of the parasympathetic nervous system. So that's a very traditional and influential model of trying to explain what they then called vegetative neurosis. It's a psychogenetic model, but people tried to really find evidence for this overactivation of the autonomous nervous system in these patients, and they couldn't find it. They've tried for a long time. In a way, the bodily symptom in such a model is only an indicator of underlying psychological problems, an indicator or sometimes even a symbol for underlying psychological problems. The cognitions, the emotions, the interpersonal behavior which characterizes these patients beyond suffering from pain, from dizziness, from anything. It's what they think, what they feel, how they behave. That's not part of the model there. I will come to that. So when trying to develop further stages of such a model, you have to become aware of the problems which arise with such a model. And in a slightly Heidelberg-centric view of things, I would go back to a paper my first former boss here, the second one is sitting here, I'm very glad about that. Gerd Rudolph wrote 25 years ago about bodily symptoms as a difficulty in psychotherapy. And to go through the things he mentioned there, he said, well, dealing with these patients in psychotherapy, we are very often uncertain, even as therapists, is there not underlying organic disease which has been overlooked? There's also uncertainty, what is the psychological problem of these patients? It's not easy to diagnose in a patient who comes to you and talks about his bodily problems, and he's not like a depressed patient ready to discuss his early relationship experiences. And so psychodynamic diagnosis is very difficult in the beginning also. There is a conflict of explanatory models of patients. The patient thinks, well, I'm suffering from pain here and there and dizziness, so I will have an organic problem there. And the therapist, with the model of Franz Alexander in mind, thinks, oh well, he's just indicating with these problems that there's some underlying psychological problem. So we have two conflicting explanatory models, and that's very difficult to, and the patient very often wishes further somatic diagnostics. So it is very difficult to build up a therapeutic relationship in this situation. And that's what Rudolph schreibt, even if there is progress in therapy, it will not be attributed to the therapy. That's something people working with these patients know very well. So in this first step of developing further the model, one aspect was to go from intrapsychic conflict, blocking in the model of Alexander, to an interpersonal and developmental perspective on the problem of patients with bodily distress. So bodily distress as a result of dysfunctional interpersonal patterns, starting with early adversity of different kinds, the resulting very often overcompensatory behavior, and then looking at the interpersonal triggerings of the bodily distress later on in life, and then also integrating what the patients talk about very often, very intensively, their negative relationship experiences around the problem of bodily distress, feeling not being taken seriously with their complaints, feeling as an imaginary patient, and so on. All the interactions in healthcare, but also with relatives and so on. As an underlying developmental heuristics, again developed by Gerd Rudolph, you could think of these patients in early development. Every child goes through thousands of circles of being in some kind of bodily emotional distress, which is expressed, and it's about reaching the important other, caregiver, mother, and it's about the reaction of the mother, a responsive action of good enough, empathic other. So will the mother, the caregiver, have some kind of explanation of consolation, of activation, of satisfaction of this negative bodily emotional state, and will this reach the child? So in situations, in many situations, this will go well, but there will be also situations in which, I'm sorry about that, in which these circles can be blocked. Think of a mother which is depressed and where this negative bodily emotional expression of the child doesn't reach the mother, for instance. And this has consequences. Repeated experiences of not having the experience of adequate reactions to the negative bodily emotional state leaves traces that negative bodily emotional processes cannot be differentiated adequately in interoception, be dealt with adequate actions, so there's some helplessness, be helped by others, and these experiences induce inadequate cognitions, catastrophizing, and the idea there must be something organically wrong because there's seemingly no help for my state. So in the next stage, you could look at bodily distress in a way as a disorder of body image. I will not discuss this problematic term in any detail, but if you look at these patients and you try to integrate these cognitions, like there must still be something organically wrong, this is a very serious disease, the negative emotions, the helpless type of help-seeking, experiencing the distressed body more as object. They give over their body to some mighty others who might repair it. They don't have the feeling of any type of self-efficacy of being able to help themselves. So metaphorically, body as object rather than as subject. This has consequences also for the psychotherapy of bodily distress. So we have to try to deal with this initial discrepancy of how the patient sees his problem and how we see the problem. So the building up of a therapeutic relationship goes through a clear recognition of the patient's self-experience. Well, yes, you have the feeling of nobody helping you, of there must still be something organically wrong, and so on, and giving the patient the feeling that he or she has a legitimate suffering. This is, in the initial stages of therapy, very, very important before any further things can be developed. There's an immediate focus on distress-related relationship episodes. We can work with the relationship experiences of these patients from the start. We don't have to go beyond what they tell about their negative experiences in healthcare to come to their early childhood experiences. No, we work with this from the start. We give them support in contextualizing the distress, so slowly expanding their explanatory model, not trying to be a missionary who tries to explain them that they in reality have a psychological problem. This will not work. And trying to support them to differentiate. Is it really the beginning of another ulcer, what they fear, or is it simply anger which you're experiencing now? These types of differentiations for many of these patients are very difficult. So, and this was one of my joys in collaborating in Discourse, was to integrate these developments in the overarching topic of this project of disorders and coherence of the embodied self, because you obviously can look at bodily distress as a process involving bodily self-identity, agency, and self-awareness, like in other diseases, of course. It's not a bodily dysfunction induced by psychological conflicts, this old psychogenetic model. It's not simply a mental dysfunction induced by bodily sensory input. It's rather a disorder of the embodied self, with all the mentioned components belonging to it. And as an aside, this descriptive category of disorder of the embodied self, changes of self-identity, agency, bodily related, is independent of the description of is it a somatic or a mental disorder. You can apply it to patients with Parkinson's disease, with multiple sclerosis, for instance, as well as to patients with somatoform disorders. So if you like, this is bodily distress as a disorder of embodied mentalization 1.0. I will come to 2.0. And before I go further, as an aside, you may have noticed that these books I showed you all look similar. It's not because they all have the same publisher. It's also because all of them have the same picture in it. And I just wanted to show this picture as a picture to you, because I think it's a wonderful picture to depict an idea of embodied mentalization, or of, as it is called, ein Antlitz auch des Leibes, a wonderful German title. It's in English, it's more simple, a face of the body. So, bringing in a brain perspective, what is the problem now? In a way, you could say we've tried to develop a developmental and interpersonal account of bodily distress, but how does it fit with what we know about what's going on in these patients, in the brains, in the bodies of these patients when they are suffering from these problems? We say it's not simply an overlooked organic disease, some pathology, tumor, infection or so, but something is going on. And how does it fit? So far, the concepts relate to some over-excitation of the nervous system called central sensitization and or activations of the neuroendocrine stress axis, although also there the empirical evidence that this is a causal factor is very weak. So for me personally and many others, a new perspective on the brain as a predictive processing machine has been very interesting because it offers possibilities to integrate a view of what is going on in the brain of these patients with what we see as psychosocial, interpersonal, developmental aspects of this problem. And many of you will by now have heard of this. I will briefly go through it. It's a fundamental paradigm shift in viewing brain function. Not looking at the brain as a passive information processing machine, but as an active organ which is constantly trying to minimize what one of the main authors calls free energy, which is information. So it wants to minimize unexpected information or surprise. So it has a telos. This is not a purely functional, it's a teleofunctional model of what the brain is doing. And this is also going back to ideas of Heinrich von Helmholtz, and I think the main current author of this is physicist and psychiatrist Carl Friston, living in London. So in the classical view, perception is processing of sensations coming in from the environment on the body, and all the rest comes later. There's a stimulus, a sensory activation, a percept, and then here it's only called prior knowledge, but it's all type of psychological modification of this perception comes in later. And you also have this type of model in models of bodily distress. It's bottom up, if you like. There's a bodily perception, and the cognitive interpretation comes in later. It's influenced by personality, knowledge, and beliefs, but it comes in after the perception. That's the classical view. And the new view is a so-called generative model of perception, where what comes out as percept is always a compromise and an integration of peripheral stimuli on the one hand, and prior knowledge and predictions of what will be perceived coming out of the prior knowledge. So, in another graph, what comes out as perception is always a combination of predictions. So from earlier experiences, like in the visual system, if you're walking on a floor with black tiles, the prediction will be you will have further black tiles on that on a completely subpersonal level. And if there are only black tiles, so the predictions are correct, then there will no stimulus be processed further upward. Only if there's a prediction error, a sudden red tile, this will be processed from the sensory organs up, and this will influence the model of the world or the body. And so the next expectation will be it's mainly black tiles plus the occasional red tile. So this is an influence only by the prediction error. And the prediction error cannot only influence the model of the body and world, it can also, through action, influence the next sensation. So through movements, or in the case of interoception, through activations of the autonomous nervous system. For instance, if the expectation, the prediction is some nervous excitation, then the nervous excitation can arise to confirm the prediction later on. And this, as I already said, is true not only for exteroception, so perception of the world around us, it's also true for interoception, which is highly central for what is going on in bodily distress. And the basis for this type of combination of predictions and sensation is a probabilistic inference machine. So the brain is inferring on a probabilistic basis what is the likely cause of this perception. And if you look at this graph here, the red one is a clear prediction, a clear sensory signal. The blue one is the prediction, and the resulting percept, the so-called posterior, will be clearly influenced by a very steep, clear sensory signal. in a situation where the sensory signal is diffuse, so compare a road in the sun, where you see the road very clearly, your perception will be influenced by this, and not so much by what you experience, how the road will look like. That's very different if you drive in fog, where you only vaguely see the road, so the sensory stimulus is not clear, so your expectations of how the road will go, and I think all of you know this experience, will be very much influenced by your predictions. And I will not go through this, but there are clear ideas about where, in which parts of the nervous system these processes are located, of predictions, processing predictions, prediction errors, etc. In more metaphorical terms, one can say, in looking at interoception, not only has your past viscerosensory experience reached forward to create your present experience, this is the influence of prior experience, but how your body feels now will again project forward to influence what you will feel in the future. That's this influence through prediction errors which influence the model and the next predictions. It's an elegantly orchestrated, self-fulfilling prophecy embodied within the architecture of the nervous system. I think that's an interesting quote. So if it is about inferences, symptoms can be seen as failures of inferences. And again, some quotes. Our explanation involves primary and secondary failures of inference. The primary failure is the emergence of a perceptive or belief that is held with undue certainty, something we know clinically, and the technical term is precision, undue precision, following top-down attentional modulation of synaptic gain. This belief can constitute a sensory percept. In other words, if you have a strong belief that you will experience pain in a certain situation, you will experience pain, independent of the type of peripheral stimulus. And then there is a secondary failure of inference when the ensuing percept is falsely inferred to be a symptom to explain why its content was not predicted by the source of attentional modulation. So, because somehow you have the experience of not being able to influence it, so it must be a symptom of an organic disease. That's the secondary type of failure of inference. To show you a clinical example, it's about patients with tremor, and there are patients who have tremor in the context of an organic disease like Parkinson's, and there are patients with psychogenic tremor. And in this experiment, these two groups of patients were compared in view of the tremor duration in percent of the waking day. And there's an objective method to measure that with actigraphy. And patients with organic tremor, like in Parkinson's disease, they had objectively tremor in about 25% of their waking day. Patients with psychogenic tremor only in 3 or 5% of their waking day. But if you ask them subjectively to record in a diary the extent of their tremor, both of them said it's much more. But the difference between objective and subjective description of their tremor is much less in patients with an organic tremor compared to patients with a psychogenic tremor who subjectively think they have tremor 85% of their day. And as a result, in this paper published in the high-level journal Brain, believing is perceiving, a mismatch between self-report and actigraphy in psychogenic tremor. I think that's a good example for this approach. And it has conceptual implications. A low precision somatic input, think of the road in fog, combined with precise predictive priors about the bodily state, is generally the precondition for these failures of inference or symptoms. The patients, if you objectively measure their interoceptive inaccuracy, can they feel their heartbeat in a correct way? For instance, they are worse, although you always think they are observing their body all the time because of their complaints, but to have a clear feeling of the objective states of their body, like their heartbeat, they are worse than non-patients. And that's well explained by this model. Stress axis activations, high cortisol or other measures which you find in these patients, they must not be a cause, but they can be a consequence on this second route of influencing, trying to minimize prediction errors. If you expect nervous activation, you activate your autonomous nervous system, so you have the nervous activations which you predicted. So the importance of beliefs, expectations, working models, inner models is not only on the psychological level, but it gets down to the basic neurophysiological level of perception. Bodily distress in this sense is a biopsychosocial phenomenon in itself. The psychosocial does not come in later, and the classification should reflect this. It doesn't fit in either of mental or somatic categories. This is a current model. I will not go through this for time reasons, but come to an aspect which is important. Still, we are asking ourselves, how does it fit with an interpersonal approach? So the social and developmental origins of this interoceptive inference are important. And here again, some quotes from an interesting combination of neuropsychologists and psychoanalysts. These two authors: active and perceptual interoceptive inference in development in children, and yesterday you talked about, I learned a new word yesterday, even neoteny. I didn't know that before. These human children at birth, they necessarily need the care of others more than other animals in our world. So active and perceptual interoceptive inference in development is by necessity mediated by the actions of caregivers that bring about physiological changes. Think of the circles I showed before, and hence shape the perception of bodily satisfaction, relief, pleasure, pain, and lack thereof. That's in childhood. And then in adult life, our perception of pain and of bodily threat more generally may vary not only according to how much tissue damage is communicated by no peripheral input, but also according to how much social support we predict is available to us in a given situation, based on these developmental experiences. Or more generally, if we are inclined by prior experiences to trust others and their potential active help during bodily threat, we may experience and react to pain-related prediction errors differently than when we are not trusting the availability or effectiveness of others' support. So this is very similar to the earlier psychosocial model, but now involving basic perceptual brain processes, and so metaphorically embodied mentalization 2.0. This has treatment implications. I will also not go through these for reasons of time. Simply say established treatment methods treating these patients with cognitive behavioral, psychodynamic, interpersonal, or even mindfulness therapy, when they're applied within the model, we must think of this as directly influencing not only psychosocial reactions to bodily experiences, but the basic interoceptive processes, and that's very attractive, I think. So I come to the conclusions. Models of bodily distress have evolved considerably from psychogenic and intrapersonal to developmental and interpersonal, from bodily distress as a sign or symbol of psychological distress to bodily distress as a disorder of the embodied self. This has considerable practical consequences, but at first these models left out the physiological body proper, and the predictive processing perspective complements the model in a coherent way. The failures of perceptual inference against the background can be seen against the background of a constitutive intersubjectivity of